So many people are interested in learning how to bake, but they're intimidated because they think that it is either too complicated or scientific. The truth is baking can be a lot of fun. It's not that complicated, and if you master just a few basic techniques, that's really all you need to know to get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is organize myself in a nice, clean workspace. I want to make sure that I have plenty of room to move around. I've organized some of my tools here as well as my ingredients, and I'm going to pre-scale things and have it all organized and ready to go. Some of the tools that I'm going to use for starters are measuring cups, measuring spoons, and whether they're wet or dry. It's interesting that probably more often than not, the confusion that people have when it comes to good, consistent baking is that they just aren't measuring properly in the first place. So with these tools, it's really all we need to get started. These are the tools we use for measuring anything. Measuring cups and spoons. This we'd use for measuring wet ingredients, whether it be milk or eggs or water. And then, depending on the source of the recipe that you're working from, most of us are going to get recipes from cookbooks or perhaps off the internet. You may come across some recipes that are going to be asked for you to measure things out in terms of weight. Let's face it, weight measurements are actually going to be the most accurate. It's interesting to note, and a lot of people run into this problem, that when you're measuring things by volume, volume measurements are based on water. So 1 cup of water, if I was to fill this up to the 1 cup mark and then measure it on the scale, it would be 8 ounces. But if I was going to be measuring flour, if I was to fill up a cup measurement with flour and to put that on the scale, it's not going to be anywhere near 8 ounces. And that's a point of confusion to many people, right off the bat. Let's take a look and see how we're going to measure flour in the first place, because, again, good, consistent measuring is really what's going to make the difference in the end. So the proper method for measuring flour for pretty much any recipe is to take my 1 cup measurement and to actually scoop the flour into the cup and then level it off when we're done. Sometimes we come across measurements that ask for you to dip and sweep, right? Which would mean I take my cup and push it right through the flour and then weigh it off at the top, right? But really, if you want to be most accurate, cookbooks recipes are suggesting you're going to scoop flour into a cup, and then we'll tap it off and make it clean like that. And it may seem like I'm going to a lot of trouble, but the fact is, again, good, consistent measuring, it's what will make the difference in the end. So the first basic technique we're going to talk about is called creaming. The creaming method is probably something that you've heard of before, even if you haven't thought about it. It's the way that we start off for many different varieties of cookies and cakes. Creaming method involves using 4 basic ingredients that we come across again and again in all baking, and that would be sugar, butter, eggs, and flour. I think it's helpful to know before we get started that if you were to think about the functions of those ingredients, it can take some of the mystery out of baking in the first place. We usually divide up our ingredients, our basic ingredients, into things that we call either liquefiers or things that are stabilizers. So liquefiers are things that are going to make our doughs become softer and perhaps make them spread. Stabilizers are obviously the things that are going to make them hold together. So the things in our basic ingredient list so far of sugar and butter are both liquefiers. They're going to make our doughs spread some more, whereas eggs and flour are responsible for holding doughs together. If you're analyzing a finished product and you're trying to figure out what went right or perhaps what went wrong, the first thing we would consider is, did I measure things correctly? The second thing we'd think about is, what is the role of these ingredients? We're going to put together a dough now using the creaming method. It's a basic dough that we'll use for all types of cookies or tarts. And it's interesting, again, when we look at this idea, this basic skill, so many things are going to be made using the same technique. Let's just jump right in and get started. The creaming method, many people would be using a mixer for putting together a dough like this. I actually like to get started, if I'm teaching somebody to make a dough in the first place, is to literally make the dough by hand. Now, you may use a mixing bowl and a rubber spatula, or perhaps a wooden spoon, or you might literally want to get right in there with your hands. Certainly using a mixer can make things a little bit easier, it can be a little bit cleaner. But if you want to really understand what's taking place when you're mixing up a dough, actually using your hands, you'll see how that dough goes together in the first place. And let's face it, people were making cookies long before mixers were invented, so it's very possible to do it the right way. I want to have, my sugar looks like it's a little bit lumpy. We talked about weighing and measuring already, and I know that when I scoop my flour into the cup, I didn't talk about sifting. If your ingredients are lumpy, by all means, they should be sifted, and that could affect the weight and thus the volume of them in the first place. My butter wants to be soft enough so that for creaming method, we want to think of our butter as being at room temperature. And to measure room temperature, I suppose I could use a thermometer, but really, I just want to see if I can dent it with my finger. And if I can poke my finger in there and see that, it's soft enough, then I'm fine and ready to go. If my butter's too cold, it's going to be really difficult to mix, especially difficult to mix by hand, but even difficult to mix using a machine. On the other hand, if the butter is too soft, my dough's not going to come together the right way, and I might wind up with something that's a little bit greasy. We're going to take the butter. I'm going to do it physically here on the tabletop, and take the butter and put it right out onto the table. And I'll just soften it with the palm of my hand. Okay. There we go. Okay. Then I can introduce some of the sugar, and you can see these things going together, being mixed together. I can use a rubber spatula or a scraper to help assist. Okay. And when it actually is soft enough that you could mix it with a spoon or a rubber spatula, you might want to continue doing this on the table. You might want to actually transfer it into a bowl. It's a little bit cleaner if we do it inside of a bowl. So in goes the rest of the sugar. Now I'm just going to continue blending. It's going to take me a few minutes to get the sugar blended in here properly with the butter. So let me work on this for a few minutes and we'll get right back to it. Okay, so I've successfully now incorporated the sugar and butter together. The idea behind creaming in the first place is that, like many baking techniques, we're concerned about the final product in terms of its tenderness and its texture. So the object behind creaming in the first place is when we blend sugar into butter, we're going to be incorporating a certain amount of air into that mixture, and the more air, the more tender the mixture will be. Now, the truth is, when we're making cookies or a tart dough or something like that, we don't necessarily want a lot of air because we don't want our cookies to spread that much. We don't want our dough to rise that much. It might make it too tender and too fragile. So doing this mixture by hand in the first place actually is sensible because I'm not likely to over-mix it if I'm doing it by hand. Whereas if I put it into the machine, as we're going to do our next recipe, we'll see that it's actually a lot easier to over-mix it and perhaps do more damage than good. So I've blended all my sugar and butter together. It's time to introduce an egg. Even as I was mixing the sugar and butter, I realized, my bowl is actually a little bit small, and it's going to be difficult to incorporate all this flour and this egg into this bowl and not have it spill out all over the place. So it's okay to move. I don't want to create more dirty dishes than is necessary, but if I find that I've chosen the wrong dish in the first place, I probably want to change it. So let's talk about getting the egg in here. I got to crack my egg on the side. Rather than crack it right immediately into the bowl of butter, I might accidentally get some shell in there. So I'll crack it here on the tabletop, right, as opposed to on the side of the dish, and put it right into this bowl. Oops. Okay. And make sure I don't have any shell inside there. I'm going to empty the egg now inside of my bowl of butter. And we'll get this blended in there as well. So putting together a cookie dough like this takes a few minutes, and if my egg is if it's cold and right out of the refrigerator, you're going to find that it's really difficult to get it blended in. If my egg has been sitting out at room temperature, it's going to be much, much easier to incorporate and to emulsify into the butter blend. Keep mixing this for a few seconds to get it blended up completely, and then I'll be ready to add in the flour. You know, one thing I don't want to forget, I have it scaled out here, but I was talking about basic ingredients as being sugar, butter, eggs, and flour. Those are the ones that actually are important in the formation and the function of the dough. Other things for flavoring, right? For example, salt, right, is really important. So I have the salt here. I can add it right now. I don't want to forget it because the dough will taste really bland without it. Other things that we might be putting into a recipe that mixes like this would be chocolate chips, right? Or perhaps raisins or nuts. Right? Again, those are only for flavor, for texture, of course, right? But they're not really going to influence the formation of the dough or how it behaves. So I've got my egg is completely blended in there right now. So it's time to go ahead and mix the flour in. I'm going to actually transfer the mixture to a bigger bowl. It's going to make it a lot easier for me. Again, I could actually be doing this right on the tabletop. It's a little bit messy. It's kind of fun. It's sort of like working with a Play-Doh. And if we want baking to be fun, hey, go for it. Do it right on the tabletop. Set that aside. All right, in goes the flour. Even as I go, I'm trying to keep my workstation clean, so stack my dirty dishes together so they don't take up too much of my table space. It's going to take a few minutes to get the flour blended in here completely. Okay, so I've been mixing this for a few minutes, and you can see it's pretty dry, it's crumbly, and again, in a machine, this would be blended very, very evenly and very, very quickly. But we want to be careful that we don't over-mix a dough. I'm going to actually pour this right back out onto the table, and I'll finish mixing it by hand. Make sure your hands are clean, of course, before you get started with any of these processes. Right. You see how crumbly the dough is. This is a very tender dough. As we gather it back together, I can feel the dough start to pull together and become more uniform. I'm going to finish up, wrap this in a piece of plastic wrap. I'm going to need to put it into the refrigerator for it to firm up. It would be a little bit difficult to roll this out immediately, but by giving it maybe 30 minutes or so in the refrigerator, it'll be sufficiently chilled that I'll be able to roll it out. You know, one of the greatest tools for cleanup or for working really just on the surface is a plastic scraper. It can help get my excess dough all into one place. Clean my hands off with it. Take a piece of plastic wrap. I'm going to put this into the fridge now. We'll come back and check that in about 30 minutes. Okay, so we have our dough cooling in the refrigerator. That gives us time to work on another project. You know, of course, any dough that you can mix by hand, you can also mix that in a machine. There are some definite advantages to working in a machine. And of course, there are also a couple of disadvantages or potential pitfalls that we want to talk about. So we're going to mix up a similar recipe right now. It's a simple sugar cookie dough. I've got my same basic ingredients as before: sugar, butter, eggs, and flour, a little bit of salt that we're adding for flavor. And in this recipe, there's a little bit of vanilla extract going in for flavor as well. You know, if you're going to be mixing a cookie dough on a mixing machine, you want to use a tool that we're going to call a paddle. Don't use a whisk for this job, or you're going to wind up breaking your whisk. And again, we're going to go in the exact same order that we did before, and that would be sugar, butter, eggs, and flour. So the sugar and butter go into the machine together. My butter, just to remind you, is at room temperature. I can dent it with my finger. Even if we're using a machine, it's important that your butter is at room temperature. As a matter of fact, when we're using a machine, it's probably more important that your butter is at room temperature. And remember that we mentioned that when we're going to be using this creaming method, we're monitoring the amount of air that we're going to be beating into our butter sugar blend in the first place. The more air that you have in there, the more fragile your dough is going to be. So if we overmix it, your cookies are going to spread too much, or perhaps they're going to be a little bit too tender, too fragile, and will break. Put the bowl in place and put the paddle in place. It's going to take a few minutes to blend the butter and sugar, but it's a little bit easier and less messy than when we're doing it by hand. I like to go on a medium speed, and again, remember that we're using a machine to take the place of doing it by hand, so you don't necessarily need to crank up the machine to high speed. Think about, if you were doing it by hand, about how quickly would you be working. You know, even as I blend it, I notice that it isn't necessarily completely blending together. Right? The paddle doesn't scrape down the machine. That's my job. And so while the mixture is being blended, I'm going to have to stop the bowl periodically, scrape down the sides to ensure that we're going to have an even blending or an even distribution of ingredients. One thing I look for when I'm mixing here also is you'll see a visible lightening of color. That means that there's air that's been blended inside there. The butter goes from being yellow to being a little bit pale white. And I don't want to get it to be too white in this case, but it'll be interesting to compare this cookie in a few minutes when we make a pound cake batter. We're going to be using the exact same technique. Okay, I'm completely got my sugar and butter blended together. I can take it off, I can scrape it down. We're going to be ready to add our eggs. I can also add the salt and the vanilla at the same time. So the eggs go in. Let's just add the salt and the vanilla so we don't forget. It's really important now that we scrape down the machine so again that we have an even distribution of ingredients. Inside the bowl, again, remember, if my eggs are not at room temperature, it may be hard for them to blend into the butter. So I can see that they're not really blending in. It's important for me to scrape it down now. Now I'll turn up the speed. That will help also. Okay, so I have the eggs are blended in pretty well. And scrape down one more time, and I'll add the flour. Now, one of the things that I notice when I'm doing evaluations of finished products, especially when we look at cookies, every once in a while we'll come across some cookies, and we'll have a tray of cookies, and some of them look great. Some of them look like they've spread too much. Some of them look like they haven't spread enough. And it's really curious when you find that all on one tray. A lot of the time that has just to do with the fact that the bowl hasn't been scraped down properly. At the bottom of the bowl, we have so much butter and sugar accumulated, and the flour is sort of stuck up at the top. It hasn't blended in thoroughly. So this stage of scraping down the bowl is something that's peculiar to using a machine in the first place. If I'm mixing it by hand, I don't run into that problem. But if I'm using a mixer and I don't scrape down the sides, we'll oftentimes come across problems like that, or perhaps other related things. Okay, in goes the flour. I'm going to start this on a slow speed, otherwise you're going to wind up wearing a lot of that flour. We talk about some of the function of our ingredients. You know, butter and sugar are there to make our cookies spread. Flour is there to hold the doughs together. The more that we mix this flour, the more it's going to become elastic in quality. So we're going to mix this dough just until it's well blended together, and then we'll perhaps even finish it by hand as we did the first one. I can see now my dough's coming together pretty nicely at a very slow speed. There we go. Now, if I need to scrape it down one more time, I can see that there's a little bit of butter on the top of the paddle here. I can just scrape that down. We can either mix it by hand on the tabletop, or we can finish it in the machine. And we just scrape it out and finish it on the tabletop. You see there's a bit of flour collected down at the bottom. You know, I could go ahead and finish this up in the machine, but I want to be careful that I don't over mix my dough. Pretty well blended. There we go. That's really all there is to that. My plastic scraper, clean off the table. I don't want to lose any of my cookie dough. Get a piece of plastic wrap, and we'll put this into the refrigerator for it to chill for a little while too. You know, there's lots of different things we can do with this type of cookie dough. We're going to roll it out and cut some cookies using different decorative shape cutters. I could scoop it perhaps with an ice cream scoop just to get a different look. I could even put it into a pastry bag with a fancy tip and pipe some different shapes out of it. Either way, it's going to help if I chill it for a little while first. It'll make the dough easier to work with. Okay, so we've made a couple different doughs now by two different methods, but again, when we consider the method, we're actually accomplishing the same thing with creaming, whether it's done by hand or done in a machine. And I guess I really wanted to showcase the versatility not of the method, not necessarily the recipe itself. Here's a couple of examples of finished cookies that I have made, and one been rolled out and cut with a decorative cutter, one we've rolled into a tube and cut, this one is scooped, one is piped. This one was actually rolled and baked and then cut after it was baked. This one was scooped and then after it was baked was rolled in a little bit of confectioner's sugar. So we have a really nice, interesting variety of finished products, but again, all based on one basic method. Let's go ahead and show some of these techniques that are necessary to wind up with this finished product. I took my dough out of the refrigerator. If I'm going to roll cookie dough, I want it to be cold. And so I've rested it for a while, but then I've also want to work with it while it's chilled. If I'm going to roll cookie dough, I'm going to need to use a little bit of flour on the tabletop. Actually, we oftentimes will refer to this as the bench top, not the tabletop, but the bench top. And so I'll reach for a little bit of bench flour that we're going to use for dusting the surface before we begin to roll. This dough is soft enough that I can press it out. But then when I roll, I might want to use a little bit of flour on the top of the dough as well as on the bottom. And again, you can see the dough is not stuck to the table. Right? A little bit of bench flour will help. Right? So I'll roll the dough. If it seems to stick at all, a little bit of flour across the top should be all that it takes to keep it from sticking to the rolling pin. And again, since my dough is properly chilled, and I've used a little bit of flour on the surface of the bench, it keeps it from sticking. You do have to work fairly quickly, and if you're in a warm room, you might find that this is a little bit more difficult than it seems right at the beginning. So I've rolled it out to a good depth. I'm going to take a decorative cookie cutter. This is really pretty. I'm going to dip it in a little bit of flour so that it doesn't stick, right? And then press straight down. Boom. And then I'll put that onto a tray that I've prepared with a piece of parchment paper. Let's cut a couple more. Always try to be economical. It takes some time to roll the dough out. You want to try to get the most cookies that you can. I am able to re-roll and reuse these scraps, but the best cookies come from the first go-round. And as I re-roll my excess dough, re-roll my scraps, remember this extra flour is going to be incorporated into the dough. If I wanted that flour there, I would have put it in the recipe in the first place. So I try to be economical with how I'm cutting them out. So that's the idea behind rolled and cut cookies. Let's try some of the other shapes. I'll gather up this dough and we'll set it aside. One of the easiest techniques is to take your dough and we'll roll it up into a log. So I took a piece of paper, took my dough, rolled it up, twisted it, and then put it into the refrigerator. So the dough is nice and cold, and I can just cut some little pieces from it, just like we would if we bought the dough in the refrigerated section of the grocery store. Okay? That's that. Pretty easy to understand and easy to get a finished product. Even easier than that, however, would be to scoop the dough. So I'll take an ice cream scoop, and in this instance, if you want to make a scooped cookie, you actually want to take the dough out of the refrigerator, let it soften up a little bit. It's going to make it easier to scoop. Not completely, but if it still wants to be a little bit cold so it doesn't stick. Right? I'll wedge it right in here, pop it right out into my hand. Okay, deposit that onto the tray. We use this technique a lot for making cookies. Scooped cookies are going to be uniform in their size and their shape, right? So you'll spread to get a nice round finish. This is a scooped cookie. Chocolate chip cookies, almost always oatmeal and raisin cookies, we're going to use an ice cream scoop. It just makes them so easy to get to be consistent in their size. Very, very easy technique. Finally, if you want to have something that's a little bit more interesting in shape, it's a little bit more complicated, is to use a pastry bag and a decorative star tip. Now, in this circumstance, you definitely need to have the dough so that it's been softened up a bit. If you're trying to pipe cold dough, you're going to have a really hard time. I actually find that even piping this much dough, right, I haven't put much into the bag, right, it's already going to take a lot of strength to force that dough out. So one of the things you can do to help yourself out, have dough that's previously been softened, or number two is just don't work with so much at one time. A little bit at a time will work very, very well. Hold it straight over the surface of the tray and pipe straight out. You see how it comes out in a neat little pattern. This is just an idea, a variation of using an old-fashioned sort of a cookie press. You could even use a cookie press for the same end possibilities. I like this look. I might stick a little nut or a cherry or something inside there to give it a sort of decorative finish. Either way, for all these cookies, they will spread somewhat. Those that are made with a creaming method, remember they have air blended into them. And because of the amount of sugar and butter in the first place and the air that's been beaten into the dough, when we cut them and we put them into the oven, the dough is going to spread. So you need to make sure that you're going to give yourself or give your cookies a little bit of space so they don't grow into each other. So these cookies are okay the way they're spread apart. These, before I put them into the oven, I have to anticipate that they're going to spread and change their shape. I want to make sure that I give them enough room to spread so they don't just grow into each other. I might want to take this cookie right here and press it down with the palm of my hand just a little bit to make its shape a little bit more consistent and even. And then just for another decorative touch, I'm going to sprinkle them with a little bit of coarse sugar. Now these are ready to go into the oven. Okay, so I've just finished mixing up a pound cake by the exact same mixing method. Really, the only difference that you might notice in my ingredients is that there's a little bit more egg in this mixture. So even though the technique is very much the same, right? We combine butter and sugar and blend it together. Right? You can see that my finished dough is going to be much, much softer. I have a couple possibilities when I'm making a pound cake. Traditionally, we put it into a loaf pan. I could also make it in a nice decorative ring pan like this. Either way, when we're going to choose a pan, you need to understand how we're going to prepare it. This one I've lightly sprayed with some pan spray and put a piece of parchment paper across the bottom so that my cake won't stick on the bottom. This one was brushed with a little bit of softened butter, and then we put a little flour on the inside so that the dough wouldn't stick. I'm going to bake mine in the traditional loaf pan this time. We'll scrape the batter into the pan. You could choose a different size loaf pan if you wanted to do one that was slightly smaller or one that was a little bit bigger. The general rule of thumb is that you want the pan to be filled about 2/3 of the way up, so you'll get something that looks good, that doesn't bake too shallow or at the same time doesn't bake out of the pan or mushroom over the top. It looks kind of awkward when it's done. I'll spread the batter so that it's evenly blended into the pan. And I've got a little trick for giving a nice finished crack across the center. I'm going to take my finger and dip it in a little bit of water. Run my finger right down the center. That's going to create a weak spot in the center of the cake so that as it rises up, crack nicely right across the center. It looks great that way. So we've talked about some of the important things we need to understand if we're going to use the creaming mixing method. And we've shown some of the versatility, and we've discussed the importance of proper measuring. And even so, if we mix and we use room temperature ingredients and we scrape down the bowl and all those kinds of things, there's still things that could go wrong. So number one, start in a preheated oven. Typically, cakes and cookies are going to be baked 325 to 350 degrees, but make sure your oven is properly heated. Choose the proper baking pan in the first place. So, thin, flimsy pans oftentimes lead to overbaked or burnt cookies. If you're using black cookware, you might find that your finished cakes are going to be darker in color. So, give some consideration to the tools that we're working with. And that kind of leads us to an overall evaluation when we're done. Now, I've got a variety of, in this case, chocolate chip cookies that were made, again, using the creaming method. Remember that chocolate chip cookies, the chocolate chips is the big variation here. And chocolate chips don't really play any role in the formation of the dough. They're just there for flavor and texture variation. So over here, you can see a cookie that has one particular shape and right next to it, one that's spread out so much more. By this point in our discussion, you should understand that the more that we have mixed that dough in the first place, the more aerated it's going to be. And if it's aerated, it'll spread that much more. So these two cookies are from the same batch. One was just beaten that much more, so it spread and became that much thinner. This cookie, right, was scooped. They were all scooped using an ice cream scoop. And you can see that this one did not spread so much. These two actually look quite alike, right? This one was just left in the pan for a little bit longer. It was overbaked. When we bite into it, you're going to find that it's unpleasantly dry in its texture. And then finally, these two cookies that are down here on the end, right, are from the same batch as well, but we didn't scrape down the bowl properly in between. So one was scooped off the top, one was scooped off the bottom, and you can see if the bowl hasn't been scraped down, there's an accumulated mass of the liquefiers, right, butter and sugar down in the bottom, so the cookie spread that much more. Now, I think I'd eat any of them, to tell you the truth, but if you're trying to find the perfect method, we have to consider all those basic parts of the technique. Looking up here at our cakes, again, you can see a really well-made pound cake over here on the side, one that is a lot of discoloration, okay? This was baked at too high of a temperature. This has got a little bit of unusual browning across the edge, and it's full of holes. This cake was over-mixed, overdeveloped, and it's a little bit over-baked. This one, on the other hand, was undermixed, and you can see, boy, the cake has very little structure. It's stuck on the bottom of the pan, right? It's really gummy. It was underbaked. There's so many things that were done incorrectly, and yet the measuring was done right. The oven was at the right temperature. All those things were the same. Of course, this was in a different size pan, but this cake was just not mixed properly. This cake was mixed properly, and it's well done in that ring-shaped pan. You can see, and you might call it a fault, right, that there was too much batter in the pan. So when we pour our batter in the pan, you want to make sure that it's just 1/3 of the way up. But it still gives it 2/3 of the way up in the pan. It still gives us a really nice finished look, but it kind of blossomed over the edges. In our next lesson, we're going to be spending more time talking about cakes, so we'll have an opportunity to discuss things like oven temperature, pan preparation, how to tell when the cake is properly baked.